As we reported at the top of the hour, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke has entered the 2020 presidential race. A new profile in Vanity Fair quotes him as saying, "I want to be in it. Man, I'm just born to be in it." Joining us now, special correspondent for Vanity Fair, Joe Hagan. He's the author of that April cover story entitled Beto's Choice. Joe, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning.
I want to dig deep into this piece. First of all, talk a little bit about how it came together.
Yeah.
You were writing a piece about Beto O'Rourke. He was not participating in the piece until one day.
Yes, I was in El Paso for 5 days. You remember there was the Women's March. He had been on his road trip, his notorious road trip. He flew home from that to be in the Women's March. And I thought, well, I've been here for 5 days reporting. I'm going to write this piece. I got to get a hold of this guy because people weren't responding to me. So I walked up to his house. And he happened to be out there on the veranda talking on the phone. And I waved him over. And he came over. We had a little chat. He said, come in and meet the wife and kids. So it's like a Sunday afternoon. And I get to see him basically, you know, with his hair down. It's like they're making breakfast. One of the kids has a fever. Dora the Explorer's on the TV. It's just like a typical family scene. So in a way, I feel like I got real insight there because here he is, you know, not prepared.
Is it your impression, Joe, that he ever was considering not running for president? In other words, a lot of people have thought the minute even he almost beat Ted Cruz, the minute he became as famous as he had become during that race, he had decided that he should run for president.
You know, I think that he actually there was a period of ambivalence for him. I mean, I think he had to think about like what he could bring and also whether he had the fortitude. You know, there was a lot of conversation that he was having with himself, whether he had this fire in the gut thing. And at one point he told me, I think I have to just make the decision and then it will come. And I think that's where he's at now, you know.
He found it on the road trip.
He found it on the road trip, which I know that some people think that, you know, there was some criticism that this was like, oh, you know, he doesn't have a job. He's like a, you know, white dude on a road trip, and there's this sort of privilege question about him. And you hear a lot of this on Twitter.
And actually, I mean, the point I raised earlier about how a woman would never have got away with that, his wife responds to that in the Vanity Fair piece, saying she'd seen some of that criticism, and she was sort of insulted because that implied she couldn't look after the kids. No, that's not what anybody is saying. Well, I'm sure she's totally competent at looking after the children for as long as she needs to. It's more that a woman in that position doesn't have the latitude to do things that are a bit wacky. And women, when they're running, they have a very narrow path to victory at the top, to success at the top, and they have to play very straight. One thing that interests me is how he dealt with the failure of losing, because he went into that Senate race in Texas. In the piece you say that night, he says they were convinced despite the polls that he was going to win. I'm always interested in how candidates deal with failure. And do you think that whole period afterwards was really just his way of coping with not winning the Texas Senate race? I think it was real coping. He was genuinely, you know, and you know, when he won a race for Congress in 2012, he also experienced a depression afterwards. Yeah, you know, everybody was telling me this when I was doing the reporting, his wife too, that he went into this funk because he's such a kind of like adrenaline campaigner. And, you know, there's a guy that is famous for knocking on doors. You know, he's a retail candidate. And so he had that same thing, but he actually lost. So it was genuine, I think, his depression. But then he worked his way out of it, and here we are. Now, you know, could there be a wacky female candidate that works? You know, is it really true that you can't do what he's doing? I don't know, but, you know.
Joe, Kimberly Atkins has a question for you. Kimberly?
Hi there, Joe.
Hi.
I mean, you quipped about him being a white dude on a road trip. And one thing that is true about the Democratic base is that it is much more diverse. You already have 5 women in the race. You have several people of color. How does he overcome the fact that he himself is a quote-unquote white dude? I mean, he himself has talked about the grip of the power resting within white men in politics. How does he get around that?
Well, he can't overcome being a white man, but he addresses that in the story. I asked him direct, you know, maybe that's your biggest problem, is that you're a white man in a party that may not be seeking that. And he said, he totally said, I get that, and if people don't, if that's how they want to vote, I understand. He said, the best I can do is I want to make my, you know, team as to represent, you know, the country, to be diverse. You know, he recognizes that the current White House is not representative of the country, and he would try to change that in terms of his team, you know. So that's where that's the best he can do, I suppose, right?
Some of the scrutiny and criticism, perhaps, of O'Rourke has been that he doesn't seem, people are not sure what he stands for.
Right.
Like, you know, that the idea that he's just this blank canvas. Is he aware of that criticism?
Absolutely.
And how does he plan to not only define himself against a very crowded Democratic field, eventually perhaps Donald Trump, but how is he going to sell himself to voters on, hey, I'm not just like a charismatic guy who gave Ted Cruz a scare, but here's what I actually believe in, here's how I can change your life.
Right. First of all, you got to know, you know, he's a canny guy. You know, he knows what he's doing. And I think one of the things I picked up was that he sees himself as somebody who can split the difference between the Bernie Sanders grassroots and the Joe Biden. This is why these two candidates are a little bit scared of him, I think. I mean, Sanders was the first out of the door to try to drop a dime on him when these presidential talks started, you know, because he sees them as a threat. Because he wants to kind of, basically thread the needle here. And whether he can do that, how he can do that, we're about to find out, you know. But he does, when he was a congressman, his thing was that he would work with Republicans. And some left-wing Democrats don't like that, you know. And in fact, his record shows that he, did sponsored bills with John Cornyn of Texas, the Republican from Texas. So, he sees that as an asset. So we'll see if he can in terms of his policy prescriptions, come up with a balance that kind of makes everybody happy. But, you know, he's going to have to define himself on the fly, really. Right?
Joe, I've got to take a break. Can you stick around for a minute?
Absolutely.
I want to continue to talk about this with Joe Hagan and our panel. Coming up, the president up and tweeting this morning. He appears to be worried about his own party blocking his emergency declaration for a border wall because he's threatening to veto that. We'll preview today's vote ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.